And here's how your Coil Master is going to come to you. This is the version 3, and we're going to unbox it here. The little red dot tells me that it's the red color that I ordered. It says it's a 6-in-1 version 3 Coil Master. Turn over the box. It's got a little scratch and sniff sticker. And as you can see here on the back, you have your scratch and sniff sticker for authenticity. It gives you the sizes, rods, 3 top caps, the base. The funny thing is it says, attention, please keep the product away from kids. I completely understand keeping e-cigarettes away from children. That makes sense to me. Why I would keep a coil jig away from kids? I guess there's small parts, they could swallow them and cause problems, but I think the e-cigarette world has gotten to that point where if they just put keep out of the reach of children on every single product, I guess they figure they're safe regardless of what the product is. Anyway, so we're going to unbox it here and have a look. Again, I don't understand the whole boxing thing. It comes in a box. Inside the box, you're going to find this bag. Comes with a little, I guess a little pouch, a little cinch cord pouch. I guess this is the idea is that if you're on the go, you're going to have this with you in your little pouch and be able to wrap up coils wherever you are. I can't imagine carrying this device around in this little bag. If I am going to be somewhere where possibly I might be spinning some coils, maybe go to the cottage for the weekend, something like that, I'm going to have a kit for sure. I'm going to have wire, things that I need, some tools. I'm not going to be carrying it in a little pouch. That's me. Let's pour this out, see what we get in here. Put this aside. I won't be using this ever. Alright, so here's your base. This is what holds the rods and consequently gives you your spot to put your wires into. It's wonderfully branded, Coil Master. It's a little bigger than the original. You spin this cap off and have a place to put the rods. The rods come in 6 different sizes. Let's see if I can line these up here for you. The rods are also labeled on the bottom what their size is. This is a 1.5 millimeter rod. This would be the 2 millimeter rod, 2.5 millimeter rod, 3 millimeter rod, 3.5 millimeter rod, and 4 millimeter rod. This system works great. So the first thing I'm going to explain to you is about the top caps. These correspond with the rods. Each top cap has 2 numbers on it, 1.5 and 2. So this is for the 1.5 rod and the 2 millimeter rod. 2.5 and 3, obviously 2.5 millimeter rod, 3 millimeter rod, and the last one is the 3.5 millimeter rod, 4 millimeter rod. The great thing about the top cap, and it also comes with this little blue screwdriver, not to be confused with the blue screwdriver that comes with every single device, atomizer, out there. This is not the same. This is not a Phillips head screw, but in fact a little blue screwdriver that is an Allen key. And the Allen key, or hex wrench, whichever you prefer, is used to, if you can see this screw, let me see if I can get in close and show you this. It might be a little difficult, might have a focus issue. There's a little screw here, right beside this hole. There's a hole that the center of the rod goes into, and there's a little screw. The little screw is what actually makes contact with your wire and presses it against the rod. If I were to use the screwdriver as an example, presses it against the rod and spins your wire around the rod. The reason that you have this little tool and that the screw has another hole, every base has 2 holes. The screw is in one hole and you have a empty hole.
is what that has to do with is the thickness of the wire that you're using. If, for example, you're trying to twist up a Clapton wire that you've spent hours making, you would be extremely pissed if you put this on the jig, went to start twisting it, and because there wasn't enough space between the rod and the screw, you ended up tearing the shit out of your Clapton coil. Completely understandable. So what they do is they made it a two-part system, or two-size system, where you take the screw out, you remove it, put it into the other hole, and let me get a little closer for this. Put it into the other hole, and consequently the amount of available space now between the rod and the tool itself has increased immensely. Now I don't know, again it might be hard for you to see that, but the actual distance between the rod and the screw has changed. I could fit some pretty big ass wire in there to twist. So that's what the little tool is for, and that's why every single cap has a screw on each end, hex screw. This is the actual part that makes contact with your wire, and that's what you would need to be able to adjust for a larger wire. Typically, I use the Coil Master with the smaller setting for the size. There's only been a few times where I've actually needed to move this screw out to the larger diameter wire hole. Most of the builds I ever make are perfectly fine using the closest screw. First, let me show you how easy this device is to use. I'm going to grab some pretty standard wire here. We're going to try some 26 gauge Canthal, and I've put in my 1.5 millimeter rod, and consequently I'm going to use my 1.5 millimeter cap, and again this screw is closest to the center, so we're not using large wire. Again, I won't be changing any of that today because I don't have any wire here that I would probably need to use that for. I don't have any Clapton spun up or anything like that. So take your piece of wire, and the very first thing you're going to understand about this jig are you have options. You can decide to wrap your coil clockwise or counterclockwise, and the reason for that is sometimes, depending on the deck that you're building the coil for, you may want the coil sitting with the leads coming out from the bottom of the coil, one going each way, for example. The other way would be you have a coil sitting there where the leads come out across the top of the coil and go each way. What I find this really helpful for is that when you want to trap a lead under a screw, for all intents and purpose, you should be wrapping the wire in a clockwise direction around the screw head, so that when you tighten the screw, it draws the wire in tighter to the screw, to the center of the screw, as opposed to if you started the lead on the side of the screw where it would be going counterclockwise. As you started to tighten the screw by turning it clockwise, it has a tendency to want to push the lead out. It wants to either push it out back towards the coil or even out to the side and out from underneath the head of the screw. So best practices when tightening leads under screws is to work clockwise. So depending on the deck that you're building on, sometimes, for example, a Kangaroo Subtank Mini has post holes that are on a deck that's higher. So you may want to put it where the leads come out across the top of your coil, and your coil has space to sit down below where the screws are. Compare that now to, for example, a Limo 2, where the deck is pretty much flat with screws, and you're going to want a coil with leads coming out the bottom that travel along the deck, get screwed under the screws, and then the coil sits up high. So the first thing you want to do, like I said, is decide which hole to use. The great thing about this, the version 3, unlike any of the previous versions, 2 or otherwise, there wasn't this choice. There was only one hole, and pretty much you were only going to coil one way. This new version lets you decide which way you want the coil to go. So I'm just going to do a standard, you know, over the top coil with, again, using 26 gauge Canthal. Put your wire through. It doesn't take a lot of pressure. In fact, you can bend your wire, and in theory, if I bend this up, I don't actually even need to hold the wire. I can do this by holding the end of the tool. I don't actually even need to hold the wire. It may be a little bit floopy, but you don't actually need to hold it. No more ripped fingers by trying to hold pieces of wire while you wrap them. Now, you will need to press it a little bit and get that wire pressed towards your rod, the center of your rod, because when you put the cap over, you need to trap that wire between the rod and the screw. Once it's trapped, you're fine now. I can just start coiling this, and it's just going to coil. It's going to grab my paper towel, but it's going to coil. And you can just roll this. It's easy as pie to roll it. Now, I'm not using really thick wire, but you can see that this is really, really simple and easy to do. Once you have the number of wraps that you want, you essentially, now because I turned this, I'm just going to unbend it a little bit and slide my coil out off the rod. Now, right now it looks a little bit ugly. The coil looks beautiful, but the way the leads are kind of ugly. So I typically will put it back onto the Coil Master and then pull out one revolution. So I usually make my coil one more revolution than what I'm actually wanting to do. And so that's so that I can get pretty ends. I like pretty ends. It's just fabulous. Anyway, so there it is, Coil Master making a coil. It's a pretty damn perfect coil. I'm going to try to get this as close as I can so that you can see it. Unfortunately, I won't find out about focus on this until editing. So, because I can't actually see the lens of the LCD display of the camera. So I'm hoping that you can see that and see that that made a pretty damn tight coil and was virtually effortless. I now have the 2.5mm rod in the jig. I'm going to show you how this tool works with using some other gauge wires. First, let's start with the beast, the 22 gauge Canthal. This wire is pretty strong, pretty beefy, pretty big. I would hate to try to wrap this wire around a little blue screwdriver. I'm certain I would rip my fingers apart. That this wire is just so tough and so hard that it's just, even just holding the end on the handle of the screwdriver would rip my thumb apart. But again, this is one of the reasons that I own a Coil Master. I'm going to do a reverse one this time, just for shits and giggles. So I'm putting it in the bottom hole, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do a counterclockwise twist. Again, my advice is hold the wire. You don't have to hold a lot of pressure, but you just put your finger on it just to make sure that it's not sliding in and out. Again, you want to start it on the jig, start it so that it touches the rod, put your cap on, and count your twists. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm just going to pull it out, put it back on, take a pair of pliers. Now, with larger gauge wires, if you do use this method to pull a coil out of your coil, pull a wrap out, make sure that the coil is pressed pretty close to the hilt, to the handle. If I were to hold this coil out here with 22 gauge Canthal and pull hard enough to pull that wrap out, I'm going to bend the rod. because the rod is only, I mean, it has to be 2.5 millimeters, so it can only be so strong. And when you put something as thick as a 22 gauge wire on it, this damn wire is pretty strong. So if I were to pull it while it's out on here on the tip of the rod, I'm going to bend that rod and consequently ruin my Coil Master. So I'm not going to do that. So my advice is, when you're pulling wraps out, make sure your coil is pretty close to the handle, and then you can, as you can see, it's working no problem. I'm pulling a coil out, one wrap. And again, I'm sure you can see that in the camera, that's one pretty damn awesome coil. I'm also going to try to show it to you up close. Again, I know that I don't know whether this is going to show up until editing, but there it is. That coil right there, that's pretty damn perfect. And there is, I'll guarantee you, there's no way, no chance in hell I could have ever done that with a little blue screwdriver. Not with this gauge wire. Continuing on, it can also do small wire. It can do really small wire. I'm going to grab, let's say, a piece of 32 gauge Canthal. Now this wire is much thinner, much thinner. Now if you were to try to do 32 gauge Canthal on a blue screwdriver, 32 gauge wire is pretty easy to wrap around a screwdriver. But since I am using my Coil Master, I'll show you that the Coil Master as well can handle small wire. The one tip I'm going to give you is, when you're working with smaller gauge wire in the Coil Master, or any coil jig for that matter, there's other brands of this type of device, is that you want to keep an eye on it and make sure that it doesn't start overlapping itself. It can do that with smaller gauge wire. Again, wire through the hole, put my thumb on it, press it against the rod, put my cap on, start spinning. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We'll make this one 11. Like Spinal Tap. It goes up to 11. This one better, isn't it? Pull it off, turn it around, make it sexy, and there you have a perfect, beautiful, let's see if we can put it in front of maybe my hand so you can see it easier. It's a perfect coil. Beautifully touching, just perfect. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you that you can do with this, and one of the benefits of the version 3 is the longer rod, and I'm going to explain that to you right now. In fact, I'm going to bring back in my 32 gauge piece of wire, my 32 gauge coil, and I'm going to say, but Vapor Noob, what if you wanted to make a space coil? Well, you can do that on here too. In fact, it's just as easy. Once you've made your coil, for example, like I have here with this 32 gauge, what you can do is, I'm going to hold, even though it's off, it's floating, no part of it's through the hole anymore. I'm going to hold one end with my fingers. I'm going to take the other end and hold them with my fingers. Actually, I can even use pliers. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to spread that coil out. See that? I'm spreading it out along the rod. It's like a spring. I'm pulling it out and letting it go back. And what I want is, I want it to be kind of a little bit even and a little bit more spaced out than what I actually want for my coil. Because then what I'm going to do is, I'm going to put my rod back on, my cap, and I'm going to press it back against the handle and compress it. Now, I'm never going to get it compressed to where it's touching like it was when I made it, but what it will do is, it will even out the spaces between those wraps. And like I said, it's actually springy. Look at that. You can make your own springs with the Coil Master. But I digress. Put it back in there, squeeze it up a bit. You can pull it. When you pull the leads while it's on the rod, you can get it to behave more like it was when you first wrapped it. Now again, I'm just pulling these. I'm going to try to pull them so that they're going in the same direction. We're going to pretend that we're going to put this into a dripper. So I'm going to pull them in the same direction so that when my finished product is something I can use in a dripping, an RDA, a rebuildable dripping atomizer. So there you have it. Pull it off. Again, spaced coil. As you can see, it's pretty damn impressive. It's spaced beautifully. You know, and this, the best part about this, about using your Coil Master and making a spaced coil, is for nickel builds. Now nickel wire is very soft, very, very soft, and typically you're going to be using it in gauges that are higher number, meaning again smaller wire, much like this 32 gauge. So when working with nickel wire, I have a piece here. I'm going to make a coil on my Coil Master. It's a lot softer than Kanthal. It's a lot softer. And it's much like working with, this is 28 gauge nickel, and it's much like the 32 gauge in the sense that it's small wire. You have to really pay attention to make sure it doesn't wrap over itself. But the reason I'm explaining this about space coils is because when it comes to nickel, it's very hard to dry fire nickel because you're going to need a mech mod. You're not going to be able to do it on your temperature control device because that's the whole point. You can't dry fire it. So you can't tell if the coil has its hot spots removed. So typically when I make nickel coils for temperature control, they're going to be spaced coils. I'll build them on the Coil Master, and then as you saw with the last wire or coil that I had, you space it out. So again, I'm just going to do that here with nickel to show you that it works with nickel as well. And like I said, nickel is finicky and it's very soft. So I'm going to put it on. Again, all I'm doing is 2.5mm jigs. There's no point. I may throw the 4mm on to show you that it does big coils as well. But here we go with the nickel. Now again, like I said, you want to make sure that it does not overlap itself, because that's just going to be a nightmare. Once I complete doing my wraps, much like before, you end up with a perfect coil. I'm going to put it on, back on my jig. Well, at least I said I'm going to. I'm going to put it back on my jig, hold it against the handle, and now pull it to stretch it out. Now with nickel, because it's so soft, you'll find that it's a lot easier to get it to push back and stay, unlike the Kanthal where it's much more springy. So I'm going to push that back, and I'm going to make these leads go in the opposite direction, like as if I was putting this in my sub tank. And there you have it, a nickel coil that's beautifully spaced, perfectly spaced. I'm not sure which is the best spot to view this in. A nickel coil that's beautifully spaced, perfectly spaced, and ready to go into your temperature control device. And again, you don't need to worry about hot spots because none of the wraps touch each other. The Coil Master sells for, it's made in China. I mean, to call it an authentic product is, you know, who invented the first one? I have no idea. I can give you an example. What I used before the Coil Master was this. It was called Universal Tools. It's the same concept. It really is. This device is the same idea as this device. But let me show you the difference. Let's go with 2.5mm. So first off, this kit only comes with 4 sizes: 2mm, 2.5mm, 3mm, and 3.5mm. So, oh, that's not right. Maybe this, oh, there we go. So it is 2.5. So the rods work a little different on this. This is magnetically held, so, you know, it snaps in. You put the wire through just like you did on the Coil Master. And you take your small end cap, put it on the rod, and you start spinning and making your coil. And if that's the only thing I ever use the tool for, the two of them work very similar. In fact, this one, as you pull it, usually you just pull the rod right out of the thing because it's just held in there with a magnet. The problem, or I shouldn't say problem, what makes the Coil Master better is, as you can see, this rod is very short, very short. And if I wanted to, for example, do a spaced coil and I start pulling, I don't have a lot of room to pull this coil out. And if you start pulling it off the end of the rod, if I pull it so hard that I'm pulling it off, well, now I'm just fucking it up. That's not a spaced coil at all. That's just a mess. And so with the Coil Master, it having a longer rod, and if I put this here as an example, it's nearly twice as long. Almost, not quite, but pretty close to twice as long, which then gives me that room to play with, to make a spaced coil comfortably. Alright, and the last thing I'm going to show you here is the 4mm jig. This thing's huge. I haven't yet found a use for it. You notice how I said yet? Because I'm sure there's going to be something, some RDA or something that I pick up that I'm going to go, ooh, I know what's going to go sexy in that. Fucking 4mm coil. Where's that Coil Master? So here it is, the 4mm. This is going to make a pretty big, pretty sweet coil. Three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Boy, does that thing eat up some wire. You're putting a lot of real estate out there on that jig. Pull it out. We'll pull one off the other side. Again, that's just me. I always do one extra. And remember too, you know the difference between a coil that has a leg, one leg going each way, is a full wrap. So if I did 8 on there, that's 8 full wraps. When guys do coils for rebuildables and the leads go the same way, and they say, hey, there's 5 wraps ready to go into my RDA. No, technically that's 4.5 wraps, because you need to be able to do a full circle for it to count as a full wrap. So technically, anytime the leads are both pointing in the same direction, that's something and a half wraps. It's never going to be a full amount of wraps. It's always going to be something and a half. People don't say it that way, but that's what it is. And as you can see, there's a pretty big ass coil. That's a 4mm. You know, I probably could fit a whole cotton gin through the hole of this. That fucker's gonna wick like crazy. In fact, I may put this in my Limo later, my Limo 2, just to fuck around with it, because that's a huge ass coil. And the Limos actually has the room inside the RBA for something as silly as this. So I may put that on and vape the shit out of it later and record that and attach it to this video, because, you know, that's what fucking crazy people do. Another great tip I'm going to tell you about the Coil Master is the rods themselves. If you want to use this to place your coil or to move your coil, when you take the rod out of the handle or out of the holder, it works really well for that. You can use this just as, you know, exactly like you see me here. Hold it in your hand. You can use it to line up your coil in a jig. You can get in there pretty tight. It's got a nice base that you can push your coil against to, you know, if you're in a deck and you're trying to push that coil over, it's very easy to do it just using this. So if you don't have any other type of device to help you with manipulating or moving the coil over, the rods themselves removed from the handle work perfectly well for that. again, this thing, same thing, it has screws that, you know, for the thickness of wire. This device was $15 and my Coil Master was $25. So if you ask me, was the $10 extra worth it? Fuck yeah, totally. Just the ability to switch the direction of the coil, the extra length in the rod, and the two extra sizes, totally worth it. Coil Master rocks. Thanks very much, YouTube folks. I hope you like and subscribe to my videos. And that's a Coil Master. Awesome product, 25 bucks. If you're lucky enough to be in the US, they do have stock in the US. So if you're in the US and order a Coil Master from Coil Master, they're going to ship it from within the US to you. I, unfortunately, live in Canada. Although I'm only 2 hours from the US border, my product had to ship from China. I think it's a customs thing. But it sucked because I had to wait just over 2 weeks before I received it. And like I said, I'll never wrap on anything other than this. It is just so easy, and it makes life so easy. In fact, some days I sit there wrapping coils that I have no need for, just because I love using this tool so much. I didn't just say that, did I? Shh, don't tell them. Okay, sorry. Coil Master, great product. Highly recommend this. Cheers. And of course, a big shout out to the Kanger sub-tank users. I love that group. Great family, great bunch of guys. Anytime you need to know any information, do a search on Facebook. You'll find it's a closed group, so even if you ask a stupid question, it's not like your wife's gonna find out. Shh, my wife's not here. Don't tell her I did this video.